So, before we begin, I want to let you know that this video was uploaded in conjunction with another video on the Brandon Bound channel called Pac-Man VR Abandoned Reality. If you want to learn more about one of the games Don McIntyre has worked on, as well as the company in charge of it all, don't forget to check that out as well. Link in the description. Thank you and enjoy. Alright, so I guess we should go ahead and get this interview underway, shall we?
Go for it.
Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and just ask you first off, so you're a graphic designer, right?
Yeah, so the role I had, Brandon, at the time was, I think it was a 3D graphic artist, I think was the title of the job there. It was fairly, it was fairly early days in terms of developing 3D graphics for games. I mean, the PlayStation was only just upon us, I think. So up to that point, it had really been sprite graphics predominantly.
Right.
So so we were essentially 3D designers, but there weren't many around at the time because the home systems didn't exist at the time to support that. So so that's a long-winded way of saying, I was a 3D graphic artist, I think.
3D graphics. Okay, that's pretty cool. So how did you start learning graphic design? Like, where did you start to learn it?
So I went to art school in Scotland. I went to the Glasgow School of Art, and I did product design there. So I was immersed in 3D graphics. Well, not 3D graphics, 3D development of products really. And so in Scotland, the UK, well, Scotland, that's a 4-year course, and then I did another year at the end of that in computer science, or a variation of computer science. And so, if you like, the amalgamation of those two things was kind of perfect when a job came up at this company called Virtuality, who were one of the first companies in the world. I think they may even have been the first company in the world to generate immersive VR systems, which were kind of unheard of at the time. And so I learned. So it was my first job. So I'm in my early 50s now, and I was, gosh, how old was I? 23, 24 maybe at the time.
So a long time ago. I wasn't even born yet.
It was thank you for that. It was a long time ago, and so we were using, but the software we're using is still around. So we were using Lightwave, which and latterly a little bit of 3D Max and a little bit of Maya, but predominantly the rendering engine, that the way that Lightwave by Newtek was created, it was twofold. So they had a really good modeling capability, but the rendering engine was excellent, and it still is. So and then we built the drivers internally to load the 3D models and the polygons into the environment, which was running. I don't think this means anything to anybody below the age of 30, but they were running on 486 DX2 machines, which you've probably got more in your watch than those machines had at the time.
Interesting.
So it was, so we had to kind of make it up as we were going along, really, Brandon.
Interesting. I did hear about Lightwave because I did read through that article you sent. So that's pretty interesting that you still use it.
Yeah, it's still used out there. I don't know if you remember a TV show called Babylon 5. Do you remember Babylon 5?
I've heard that name, but I don't think I've seen that, no.
It was one of the kind of preeminent, it was around about the time of post generation Star Trek stuff. Anyway, so all the modeling, all the if you like, the in sequence 3D models were built using Lightwave. And so it was quite accessible, so up to that point, creating graphics of that kind of, that fidelity, you'd really be using Maya or something really super expensive. So Lightwave isn't inexpensive, don't get me wrong, but it was much more affordable than some of the 3D systems that had taken place before it.
So where did you first hear about Virtuality, the place itself, the company, and what was the moment you first heard about it?
Yeah, so I do, and that's a really good question. So there's a newspaper in the UK called The Guardian, one of the bigger newspapers alongside the Times and the Observer, these type of things, and they advertised for a 3D graphic artist, and I think I had a number of, as graduates do, or soon-to-be graduates tend to have, I had lots of CVs, resumes, I guess you would call them, and I had one left. I remember I had one left as a poor struggling student. So I stuck it in an envelope, and I thought I don't stand a chance in hell here. And it was a 2 or 3 interview process, and I was hoping they could understand me. Never mind, give me the job, Brandon. And they were based in Leicester, which is in the East Midlands of England. So it's a different country, halfway down the UK. And but they were, as the article that you read kind of surmised, they were way ahead of their time. Really, they were doing some really, really interesting things with respect to designing those immersive experiences. And I had never heard of them. I should have, but I had never heard of them prior to actually working there. And then they became quite well known after that. Not because of me, you might add.
Nice. Okay. I do have so as I've been doing research, I have had this one question that I've been going back and forth on. So the console itself, like the VR machine itself, is that whole thing called the virtuality as well? Because I've also heard it called the Visette. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, right. Okay. No, that, again, you've done your research. So Virtuality is the company, and was the company. There was then they developed a number of generations of 2 machines, imaginatively called an SU and an SD, stand up or sit down. So it was the first generation of each. So the first generation of stand up and sit down. There was the second generation, and the thing that you put in your head was called the Visette. So the Visette was, if you like, the trademark that was, and I still have one floating around here somewhere. I'm sure I still have one. Yeah, maybe my parents have it or something. And they were actually really, really well designed. I mean, it felt, it wasn't as if the company was manufacturing off in the Far East. There's nothing wrong with that. They were doing everything in-house. They were designing the product design in-house, so the actual hardware, the chipsets, the cards, the graphics cards, everything was in-house, which was partly I think led to the fiscal challenges that went on there, because that just doesn't make any sense. You'd never do that now. But at the time they had this organization, and in one factory, in one building in Leicester. Yeah, it's strange to think that, isn't it?
So you have played the virtuality machine yourself, right?
Oh, endlessly.
What was your first experience? How did you feel when you first experienced virtuality?
Yeah. So, gosh, these are all good questions, Bandit. So when you enter the building, they actually had a number of, if you like, glass windowed offices, where they had, or showrooms, for want of a better term, that had these machines. So as part of the interview process, they give you a shot of one of these things, and it's quite. So it's quite a disarming experience, but I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you cover your eyes, there's almost a kind of a Freudian association there. You feel a little bit entrapped. You've got something wrapped around your head. There's a ratchet system at the back that tightens itself. It's almost the equivalent of a blood pressure cuff, but right. So you feel quite disorientated because you can't see anybody else. But as soon as you give of yourself to that environment, it's actually, even in those days, where it's very blocky, you're shifting 23, 24 frames per second max, that's why you're getting out of that. But it was fabulous. And the first game I tried was one called Zone Hunter, which is when you were a kind of cyborg and you were taken through the cityscape shooting things. You were on rails, so it was rubber banded, so you were dragged through. You didn't have to negotiate left and right. You just point and shot, and you could see your own gun, so you could turn around. And bearing in mind that these are coin-op machines, Brandon, so so the whole experiential aspect was very different. People didn't have consoles at home that allowed them to spend hours becoming used to an environment. They put £1 in, which is a lot of money in those days for it. I don't know what that would be the equivalent to in the US.
Maybe. I think I've heard it was I want to say $5 for 5 minutes. I can't remember where I saw that, but yeah.
Yeah, but that sounds about right. So you had to provide to the user a sufficient level of value for that £1, for that $5. And the way you do that, I think, is to make it interesting for him or her, and make the attainment, the risk and reward thing, keep that balance right. So you provide the user with the sense that they are doing a lot more than they actually are in the experience. Where you'd never get away with that. You wouldn't get away with that on a console machine, because that would be it wouldn't be seen as challenging enough, I don't think.
Was the headset itself, I do have a question, was like, how heavy was it, if you remember?
So how heavy are that? It must be about, again, I'm going to be in metric rather than imperial here, probably about, I've got some old specs actually, if you ever want to see those. I'll maybe send you those over.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've got the old hardware specs knocking around somewhere. I think about 1.5 kilos potentially. So I don't know what that, you need to do some.
I don't know. I'll look that up, but.
But it was, I mean, so the fundamental difference one of the fundamental differences between the first and second generation machines, where the first generation, it essentially looked like you had a cardboard box in your head that looked like it was, you were going to, but the second generation machines, they wouldn't look out of place now. They were very elegantly designed. It was almost looked like, they almost looked like something out of Battlestar Galactica type of thing. You had this rim around the front, and it was light, and it was a significant advancement on the previous version. There always is the problem with people because they were public machines being a bit sweaty, and there was perspiration. We can't avoid that, and in certain territories. Making a nice nod to my Italian brethren here, people didn't like their hair getting messed up with these things. We had all those kind of challenges depending which part of the world you were in. They weren't sufficiently heavy that it became an impediment, to put it that way. They were you would tolerate it because there was a sufficient level of engagement that you got from the game.
Do you remember like all the projects you worked on? And if so, like, what were they? Okay, so, I worked on a full range of kind of games. So there was one of the more successful titles they had was called Dactyl Nightmare, which was a ridiculous concept where you worked. But it was quite a well-known game, and I think it was referencing Lawnmower Man and things like that. So you had 5 platforms, one in the centre and 4 around it floating. And you would shoot each other, and then for reasons best known to somebody else, there was this arbitrary pterodactyl, don't know which it is, that would come and lift you off. And the whole point of that was you'd look up, and so you get a sense of the space. So that was a successful title. I worked on the follow-up to that, Dactyl Nightmare 2. I worked on a game called Buggy Ball, which was fantastic. That there's footage of that somewhere online, and if there was a game that was destined to propel that sit-down machine to success, it would have been that one, I think, had the company not went under. And what that was based on is a game that they play in France, in beaches, I'm told, where you get guys with their hot rods and customized kind of Volkswagen Beetles punch a massive soccer ball around this beach and on all the cars. They crash into each other, so it's almost like football with cars, but it was in a dome. And so we had 4 cars. It started off with 4 cars, and we'd be battering this in this massive dome, and battering this football. And the goal was to get it out of the dome. And the game lasted so long in terms of development that the developers started to get very creative with the vehicles that they developed. By the time we finished it, there was a tank, there was various levels of kind of grandiose cars, and the chap that coded that, called Martin Brownlow, very smart guy, he lives in the US now, and has become very well known at the development of physics engines in games, because the engine and the mechanization and just the physics of that game was so cleverly put together, miles ahead of its time, but probably too difficult. So that was Buggy Ball. Pac-Man was a big one. Obviously, that was developed just before the company went under, and that's probably why it's become quite legendary, because it was the biggest title we probably would have ever had done. Those are the 3 big ones that spring to mind. There's lots of little bits and pieces, but kind of pet projects, but those are the 3 major titles that I suppose would be, you can get those on YouTube now, and they're still around. Buggy Ball actually sounds, have you heard of the game Rocket League? It sounds very similar to that because it's a game where you drive around in cars and you basically play soccer, but you're using cars. So it sounds a lot like that. It's interesting to think that concept was a lot earlier on.
Absolutely. And one of the fascinating things about Buggy Ball, and in many ways informed some of our thinking about Pac-Man, was that, so you were I think one of the cars was a beach buggy. Now, so you would be sitting in this car, and so you could see your steering wheel, I think, and you're viewing over as we would see, the bonnet, that you guys call it something different, the front of the car. But if you put the car into reverse, you could turn around with the headset on, you would see at the back of the car. So in that way, it was exactly like driving a normal car. So the physical immersion was really quite fascinating, because you start to forget you've got the headset on. You start to react in a way you would do in a normal, driving a normal car. And watching people was almost a spectator sport in itself. We had on the studio floor, we had, I think, 4 stand-ups and 4 sit-downs. And we could play them at any time. And watching people get so immersed and giving of themselves, it was hilarious to watch, because people then forget what they're doing, So, yeah.
Have you heard? I think it's because the website is Virtuosity Tech now. I think that's their new website. I think they've said something about wanting to do remakes of their old games. Do you know anything about that, or
no,
have you heard about that at all?
No, we've got there's a kind of closed Facebook group of the guys used to work there, and we occasionally jump on that and see what's what, and that's where I got the tech specs from. Everybody's remained in technology to some extent, but most of the guys moved into games, because obviously 92, 93 games industry just went absolutely biblical. Although and there's always behind the scenes in the UK, we're always kind of well equipped for that, I think. But it doesn't surprise me. But the challenge, but it would be quite kitsch, Brandy. It is not compared to what's available in other platforms now. It's not going to be particularly entertaining. It's got a nostalgic value to it, but that's all. But only to perhaps people of a certain generation, such as myself. I think you could probably mock something like that up so easily now in a fairly open source game engine. Put on an Oculus Rift and off you go. Because there were so many barriers to doing that at the time. It felt novel, and it was remarkably ambitious looking back. I think I said that in the article. The scale of ambition was quite incredible, really. They were essentially done for by the console games industry, which obviously did the same, but in a home setting.
Maybe they'll do what I was thinking was probably because how some other companies repackage their old games as a collection, release them like that. I was thinking something like maybe a virtuality collection, put that on like modern VR headsets or something.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And I think there's certainly a market for. I mean, the way that the computer science education worked here in the UK in the 80s, which I'm sure you weren't even around for, Brandon.
No.
It was taught in schools. So we had with a machine called the BBC Micro, which was a 16K. There was a 16K version, 32K version. And you were taught it as part of high school education. At least you certainly were in Scotland. I think you probably were too. So there was a level of understanding of basic beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code, as it stood for, and there's a sense of possibility. So now, if you jump on YouTube, there's a whole bunch of as you're suggesting there, VIC-20 Synchronous Spectrum games, and they get a lot of traffic, as does your site. So you're absolutely right. There might be scope for this bundling of this experience together as something, that would be great. That would be great if they did that.
Did you do anything else other than graphic design at Virtuality, or was it specifically just graphic design that you did there?
It was only 3D modeling. Yeah, it was only 3D modeling. So, so what we would be doing is modeling up the characters and environments using Lightwave, texture mapping them. So, and then running it through the engine and making sure the frame rate stayed high enough. My background in, which was as I mentioned, was a combination of 3D product development and computer science. I needed to have them both, I think, because if you were skewed one way or the other, you would have found the other one quite challenging. So there was always a bit of manipulation required to make sure that you could deal with Z buffering. For example, let me explain what Z buffering is. So one of the challenges we had is in 3D graphics, if one, and games, it's not a problem anymore, but it was when you had limited memory. If one object is in front of another, like this, if I've got my phone there and a book here, the machine will sometimes not be able to determine which one is in front. So you have to go through and prioritize objects in space, and at different points, depending where the viewer is. And that is a laborious, time-consuming exercise, because you can imagine how many permutations there are. And it's almost like layers in Photoshop. You've got to make sure. Now, you don't have to do that anymore, but sometimes you would end up building 4 or 5 versions of the same model. We did that in Pac-Man. So if an object is far away, for example, we would have one polygon and texture map it. But as soon as that became closer, we would need to create a medium res version of that graphic and swap it out, and then a fully res one. And so rather than what we do now, what happens now is just create we don't care, there's all the polygons in the world. But there we had, because the minute the frame rate drops, people are sick. If generally 22, 23 frame rate per second, FPS, anything below that, and it creates motion sickness. So we had to constantly adjust the models for that. So as again, a long-winded answer to your question, in addition to the 3D modeling, there was the manipulation, I suppose, and tweaking of that in the engine to make sure that it was going to function, it was going to perform at an optimum level.
Gotcha. And were you the only graphic designer at Virtuality?
No, we had
others.
Thinking that, yeah, I think the software team, of which I was part of, gosh, I think there must have been about 20 software, maybe 17 to 20. And that was probably a 50-50 split between developers and artists, as we were called. I'm never sure why I was really an artist, but but then there was a kind of concentric area of interest between the two, where, as your previous question surfaced, that you had to have a little bit of an understanding of the same way that happens with web development and UI development. The good people in that job understand a little bit about what they're doing, the context within what they're doing has to eventually end up, and vice versa. So yeah, I think it was about 17 or 18, Brandon.
And so were you how did you get hired to work on Pac-Man VR? Was it something it was just a no-brainer to hire you, or was it something you applied for? Or?
No, it was so it was not nearly as sophisticated a process as you might imagine. So we are part of an in-house team. So we worked on all the titles. So we had 17, I'm calling it 17 people. And the studio, we would just develop games based on ideas. So it really was quite utopia in that regard. We would think of an idea, and we would create a prototype or a demo that would exploit the benefits and opportunities that having this 3D world allowed. And then occasionally, through some part of the company that dealt with licensing, we'd have the opportunity to work on licensed games. So and Pac-Man was one of those, in conjunction with Namco, obviously. There was another one, whilst I remember, I didn't work on this, but with Olin, the rifle manufacturer. We don't have too much of that in the UK, but that was the US-based deployment, I think. And Jaguar, do you remember the Jaguar console?
I do, yeah. The Atari.
Okay, so we Atari, that's right. So we, in fact, and Martin Brownlow, who coded Buggy Ball, he went over and moved and worked on the Atari platform, and then his career just went stratospheric. If you Google Martin Brownlow, he's up to some very interesting things these days. He's a very clever guy. He drank a lot of Diet Coke, I remember. Gallons of the stuff. So I was just, I was not plucked from obscurity, unfortunately, Brian. I was literally the guy that was free to work in Pac-Man. That's as grandiose as it became, unfortunately.
That makes sense. Do you have any experience with did you have any experience with the Pac-Man series prior to working on it, like when you started?
No, but we all loved games. I mean, I think that was a prerequisite for getting involved with the company. You know, we all loved playing games, and again, I'm not sure how this works in the US. You'll have to forgive me, but so Pac-Man was also in pubs in the UK on tabletops. You know, you could put a pint down, you could play it. So yeah, I played it an awful lot, but I wasn't as familiar with. I mean, on YouTube, I've had some really obscure questions from people asking me about the backstory to the characters. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like I'm just working on it.
Yeah, so it's great that there's that kind of cult item around it. And as part of another job, I worked in virtuality. I worked with Kawasaki on a motorcycle simulator, and that involved me going over to work in Japan for a little while. And then I really realised just how much of a cult theme Pac-Man was and is. You know, so and fair play. It's a really great. It's a really fascinating and remarkably skill laden endeavor, you know.
Yeah. So you only ever played like the arcade game?
Yeah. But we obviously had when we built the game itself, we had to get all those details right, you know, in terms of right down to the RGB values and the feel of the character and the ratio between all the facial objects. And one of the challenges we had there was the sizing of all that stuff and getting it to run quickly, because in terms of what's the term, the paradigm that we've got. If you think of Pac-Man, the thing about Pac-Man which is fundamental is you can see everything at once. Right, so if you're down the bottom right hand of the maze, if the ghost is top left, you can see it. Okay. When you were in the virtuality game, you didn't know that because you were seeing through the eyes of Pac-Man, so you had no idea where your adversaries were. So that it made it an entirely different game, and we had to think really hard about that because we put a little world in miniature, a little map in there. But bear in mind, remember, you've only got a minute, maybe 2 minutes, to get used to that. That's asking a lot of users to take into account. Shit, this is brand new equipment. What do I do with this controller? Oh, that's a map. And so, bang, a minute's gone, and people leave feeling underwhelmed. So, whereas you can buy a pint, a beer, and sit down in a pub, and you know what you're doing in Pac-Man from the minute you put your pound in. It's because you're seeing this as the whole world that you're involved, your environment is laid out in front of you. Whereas Pac-Man, it was Pac-Man in name only because the way that you played it was different. You played it almost like an FPS, really, because you had no real sense the first time you played it anyway, possibly even a number of times, where everybody else was in that environment. And that's something we really kind of went, shit, I never thought of that. And so we were kind of making up as we went along. We really were making up as we went along.
So you were talking about earlier how you were part of virtuality because you liked games, right?
Yeah.
So I was curious, what was your past experience with games before joining virtuality? Like, what got you into video games?
So I mentioned before about the BBC Micro. So there was there's a very different complexion. If you ask somebody my age who's American and someone who's British, they probably have a very different. Maybe they won't. I would imagine they have a different kind of tale to tell here because we had the simpler Spectrum in the UK. So we had the ZX80, ZX81, and then the Spectrum, which was 48K, and that. It was during, I'm guessing mid to late 80s, was an absolute phenomena in the UK. And bearing in mind, we're getting taught this at school as well. So you've got a perfect storm here. So you'll be able to learn some coding at school, and then you've got pretty much affordable machines to use at home, and they had the ZX Spectrum had kind of famously spongy keys, and so you had Manic Miner, Jet Set Willy, Frogger, all these kind of really early stage 16-bit games. I actually didn't have a Spectrum. I had a VIC 20, which is 3.5K, would you believe? And then a Commodore 64, which was 64K, and they were fantastic games machines as well. They had a trickier operating system to develop on compared to the BBC, but you were either one or the other. You were either Spectrum focused or you were Commodore focused. And people may disagree with me on that, but that was my experience. So I, wasted away my late childhood years by way of the Exploding Fist. Was a fantastic game on the 64. Boulder Dash was great in the 64. International Soccer, which was a cartridge game, which you could slot in the back. So there was kind of ROM cartridges. And then I didn't do so much with the arcade stuff. But yeah, so it was really early stage, right at the grassroots, I think, Brandon, of games. And I even started trying to build my own as well. And then you miss a passage of time, and then PlayStation and Xbox, and I was fairly into that too. But that was after virtuality, obviously. That was, that came after virtuality. But so it was those it was those machines that you felt you were part of this kind of club. I mean, literally with the VIC 20, you could press the escape key and you had the code. So you had a situation where you could alter the code, save it to cassette, share it with your friends. He or she would have a go at modifying it. So you had this kind of innovation purpose, I suppose, but that you were sharing this. And Scotland is famous for game developers. We've got Grand Theft Auto was developed here, Lemmings was developed here, and it's still Dundee, which is a city not far away from where I am just now, is got a number of game studios in it that produce titles that you'd recognise, and that's because I think we had this perfect storm of, I think we're an innovative nation anyway, but I would say that, but I think, there was the Timex factory, which is a manufacturer of the Spectrum, were up there. They were in that town, so it may even be the case that some machines found their way into Dundee, what can I say, and it allowed young people to start developing on them. So yeah, my experience was from very young is on tape-driven machines, playing about with them and breaking them and trying to rebuild them.
So do you remember specifically what you did on Pac-Man VR? Like, what did your work of the game entail specifically on your end? So pretty much out with the coding of it, everything. So I did all the in-game graphics. I did the walk, which took me ages. The run that they had, all the texture mapping. Yeah, everything you see there, I designed and created. Although I can't lay claim to the design really, because that was Namco. But you're the repurposing of that into a 3D environment. A guy, the developer, is a guy called Andy Reese, really smart guy. I think he's out in Japan now. Hello, Andy, if you're hearing this. He was great, and so it was just the two of us. A two-man team for a project of that size you'd never do that now. It would be a cast of it would be scores of people, but no, it was just the two of us. So Andy did the code, and everything else I put together. Interesting. Do you remember how long development lasted specifically?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me that. I think it was about 8 months. I think it was about 8 months, six to 8 months. So Andy had the environment built, and then I think he rebuilt it. We really wrestled with how to get the frame rate up, and we had a couple of false starts there. We realized that we couldn't build the sphere for Pac-Man because we'd run out of we couldn't run the frame rate. So what we ended up doing is pre-render. If you could follow me here technically, Brandon, I'm sure you can. But what we had to do was pre-render a yellow sphere onto a single polygon with an alpha channel around the side. Having the alpha channel around the side meant that we could make it transparent, and because we had we were depicting a single light source, it meant that if we then created the eyes and nose and mouth with as few polygons as possible, we could then rotate that round that single polygon, if you're still with me. So basically, as opposed to having but that took us weeks to work out how to do that, because what we obviously thought we would be doing right out the blocks was just creating Pac-Man, but we thought that was all our polygons used up for the whole environment. So we had to find out a way of creating the illusion of having a sphere, and we did that by pre-rendering it in Lightwave, taking a snapshot, and then so what you're actually following around, or what you actually are in the maze, is really just a single polygon. And that was a trick that was used by a lot of developers at the time in terms of getting frame rate down. You would pre-render one aspect, and then you would rotate around an axis the elements that were actually far less polygon intensive.
Yeah, I do remember that trick actually being used in other games I've played. First thing I think of is like Mario 64 for the Nintendo 64. That one has a lot of characters in the game that do that same trick, where their bodies are just like a 2D sphere, and then they have the facial features just move around like that. Yeah,
that's bang on. So there's me thinking we did it first, but obviously but there was, that was quite a close community. All this, we're all trying to figure stuff out, Brandon, at the same time, and because there was no copybook in this. There was nobody had done virtuality before, so we were figuring all this stuff out really during these very long nights and weekends that we would be having to spend putting the stuff together.
So you said before, I think it was like in the article, that you did playtest the game. At like the De Montfort University.
Montfort, that's university in Leicester. That's right. Yeah.
Do you have any memories of that playtest?
Yeah. So again, gosh, that's really good questions. I mean, so we took it. We took a machine, which is no small endeavor, moving a machine of that size into this cafeteria area. And people loved it. And it really got us enthusiastic about how successful it could potentially be. It was one of the challenges that we had, probably the biggest challenge, is how accustomed we became to the game. And one of the challenges we had was navigation. So the way the machines worked is in the Visette, there was a tracker, and then in the handset was a Polyhemius tracker. And they would interrelate with each other and with the base unit. So Andy had control. We had control over the essentially accelerometers that existed in each of those items. And one of the challenges that we had was how to support users navigating around the game. The button on the top, if I remember, there was a fire button and a button on the top. The button on the top we had for going forward. So what happens in any kind of 3D environment is the minute you cover your eyes, your awareness of where your other limbs are changes. People would swear that they've got their hand out in front of them, but they don't have. It's off to the side. And that will send Pac-Man spinning. So we had to experiment with the maths around about at what stage in that exponential curve you make the assumption that the player wants to move around, or has he or she just made a mistake about where they want to point the Pac-Man. And then we had to marry that with I suppose the question of, do they want to go in the position they're looking at, or do you want to be able to, as was the case with Buggy Boy, do you want to be able to turn around without going in that direction? So what we did at De Montfort was road test all these ideas. So I think we went down there 2 or 3 times. It's just in the city centre of Leicester. And so we went down, you would almost call it A/B testing now to some extent, if you're doing it online. And we would try these different navigation features out. But as I say, we began to get too used to it. And we constantly had to remind ourselves of the fact that as we got better at it, we started to become blind to the challenges that a new user would have. Which is, gosh, this is a new piece of kit I've never tried before. If you've got a minute, there's 20 seconds getting over the fact you've got something on your head. and it doesn't fit quite right. And what does this do? And then you're halfway through the game. So there's all those kind of experiential service design features, as you call it now, to work through.
Did you ever play? I assumed you probably did, but did you ever play Pac-Man VR yourself?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, I mean, I loved it, and it wasn't. I mean, I don't know how other game developers feel, but you don't always love the things that you do. Sometimes there was. I mean, some of the games were developed to exploit the nature of the 3D environment. There's nothing wrong with that, but it didn't make for a particularly engaging user experience necessarily. But in the consoles that we had in the room where we were all based, you could tell the games that were going to be successful because people went back to them and played them. And Pac-Man was one of them. Buggy Ball was the other that we went to, quite a lot. And in fact, the theme music for Buggy Ball is imprinted on my mind, from all these years ago, because it'd be piped in the studio. But so I played it. I played it mostly to get a sense of how things looked, and it was weird. It was weird to kind of build something in Lightwave, drop it into the engine, and then move away from your desk, put in the Vizette, and play it. And it was quite, that never gets old. That never gets, even I would imagine even now if I were to do it, something quite novel about seeing something being immersed and seeing a sense of scale against something you've actually created. Would
you rank Pac-Man VR in your top 3, or?
Yeah, I would. Once we got it right. Not at first. Once Andy, it was all Andy. He was so clever. He got the maths right around about the movement, because it was, it was very clever the way that he managed to blend the intention made by moving the hand, moving your head. Once that was there, then it became, it was, and you turn around, there was a ghost behind you. It was quite jarring, you got a fright. It was really clever.
So you said before, I think it was a comment on my old video about the game, that there were 2 more stages planned for the game. Do you have any more specific information on that?
You know what? I tried to find my sketchbooks, and I've obviously moved house many, many times since then. And I couldn't, sadly. But the next stage was going to be an Aztec temple, and I can reveal that. And so we had worked all that up. Where we hit some challenges there was, if I remember rightly, Namco were comfortable for us to release that first level, but they wanted more creative direction over any subsequent level, which I fully understand. Because we, as a small little team, were used to just doing what we wanted, figuring things out. So I had this idea of one of these little kind of Mayan temple with, waterfalls, and I'd figured out a way of getting the water to look kind of semi-realistic and flowing down. And you can imagine almost a snakes and ladders style movement. But I probably, if I did, dramatically underestimate the strategy and the sophistication of the strategy that is plumbed into the first level. It's so well put together. There's a reason why that map is the way it is. So we didn't really get that far. But in terms of thematically, that was the plan. It was to create the second level. I can't remember what the third one was going to be, but the second level was going to be a little Mayan temple.
So what was the main reason for these stages not being included was because of the company going under, or?
Yeah, that was it. That was a great shame. I mean, because who knows what would have happened, but the company reached a kind of natural end, because that, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, it was the experience that the novelty aspect was no longer there when users could essentially have the same experience in their own home. 3D graphics became much more powerful, and some of the engines that were beginning to 3D engines that were emerging were better than the bespoke setup that we had, and so it was a natural conclusion, I think, to it. And everybody went off and did interesting things. Most of them are millionaires now living in America. I joked with somebody I am not one of those people, on my hand. But yeah, but it was a real interesting sandbox. I've had very few jobs since then that have allowed so much invention and flexibility in terms of what you were able to do with similarly inclined colleagues, you know.
So the Pac-Man VR game it did get released in arcades. So what I'm curious is, those two stages, were those to come after the initial release? Okay.
Yeah, that was the plan. That was the plan. I had started to work up, so the Aztec Temple stage, I'd started to work up, and I had it pretty polished in Lightwave, actually. And so once you've got the physics, so the heavy lifting technically was done. We knew how Pac-Man run. We knew how to keep the polygon count down. We knew the logic. So all the stuff that took up a lot of the time was cracked in the first level. So in theory, adding subsequent levels wouldn't have been exponentially as time intensive as that first level.
Right. So I'm not sure if you've heard about the recently, I think it was like back in 2021, the game files for Pac-Man VR somehow got around, I think because Virtuosity Tech were selling off the original copies. So the original files for the game managed to get online, and people noticed that there was a like some sort of demon face sprite. I don't know if you've ever seen it before or know what we're talking about.
We always put Easter eggs into these things. So that may have been my doing. I remember for one of the games we did, which was a little bit cheeky, the second Dactyl game, the only other Scottish guy working there was the chap called Derek Pettigrew. He sat next to me, and we were cruelly called the Scottish Corner. The rest of the guys were all English. And so we had a tartan shield in this particular game. Now, if you shot it in a particular way, the shield would move and you'd see our initials in this game. And so we all the games had something like that, and if you knew what to do. I must have built that, Brandon, at one stage. I can't remember doing it, but I must have created it at some stage.
So after the company went under, what did you do?
I went to London. I opted to jump into the web and software world. So the team went one of two directions: either in games, remaining in games, or into software and web and that kind of new media. And I did the latter of the two things. And I went down and worked for a small web company that became a very big web company, a company called KBW that became Oyster Partners, which grew into the UK's biggest web development company at the time. But this was where we now, 97, 98, so dot-com boom was just around the corner. So that's what I went to, and more fool me, because I'm not sure I backed the right horse, but as the game world exploded. But then I worked through a number of, if you like, software and design type companies since then, really. So that was Virtuality was my only real foray into the kind of games development environment.
So what do you do now? Have you still done graphic design stuff, or have you?
So I'm design director at the Innovation School at Glasgow School of Art. So I have more of a kind of leadership role in design, and design as strategy, really. So that's looking at how creative thinking can be used in all kinds of workplaces and environments to make the world a better place. And I also work for an innovation centre that's focused on health and care. And so again, running a design team, which is actually from the Glasgow School of Art, developing products and services for health and care. So, but at its core, all the roles I've had have at their core kind of a creative practice that goes right the way back to Glasgow School of Art in 1989, Brandon. All places, it's a long time ago. But I still look back at Virtuality very fondly, and it was a great team, really smart bunch of people, and a fantastic and inventive time. And and Pac-Man would have been, I'm biased obviously, but I think it would have been fantastic.
How do you feel about more people starting to take interest in this stuff again? after like such a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I get messages quite a lot, particularly from YouTube. And I don't know what it'd be. Maybe you'd better place to tell me what causes that. I think it's I think it's nostalgia. I think it's perhaps novelty takes on almost a second wave to it. It's not just about people remembering it. It's people seeing it as almost a relic. And how does that make you feel? You know, what is the experiential aspect of that? How does it differ from what we have just now? And I think also Pac-Man in particular, because of there are cultural connotations there that we were really unaware of, and I should have known more about, really, if I were to be honest, at the time. And that has So, and I think just that the cult of Pac-Man oscillates, and as it increases in interest, then I'm sure people are seeking out and coming across your videos and other videos more frequently.
Right. I can't speak for anyone else, but for me personally, I grew up with like games from the NES and SNES. Even though I wasn't born in that same generation, I did grow up with those games because that's what my dad used to play, and he showed me those games. So that's pretty much where my interest came from, is just playing them when I was younger. So I do have one last question. Is there any other interesting facts, either about virtuality or about Pac-Man VR, that people may not know that you would like to share?
So I suppose that the main one was the one that I mentioned earlier on, that the difference in paradigm. So with Pac-Man traditionally being a 2D game that you could see, right in front of you, you could see the world in which you were inhabiting, and you can see where the ghosts were. You can see what happens when you change color. The virtuality, the VR version didn't have that. In terms of the immersion into the game, it was almost a first-person shooter style, and in that way, it was entirely different. The other aspect was how difficult it was to get the navigation right, and to figure out a way in the time that people had to play the machine, to play the game that they'd spent money on, albeit not much. They didn't have long to orientate themselves. So it wasn't just about the fidelity of the graphics. It wasn't just about the hardware. It was about making people feel that they'd had a meaningful and worthwhile experience in the small time that they had. And sometimes what that meant was dumbing down the experience as opposed to making it more sophisticated. And that was the paradox that existed, and that's something that we were guilty of ignoring, was as we started to play the games more, like Buggy Ball and Pac-Man, we probably made them too difficult because we were getting so used to them that we were adding complexity to it. Buggy Ball, for example, had a tank. Not only did it have a tank, it had a tank that could shoot things. So you could shoot the ball. This is how ridiculous it got. Now, we didn't really didn't need to add that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I know the minute we end the call, I'll think of something particularly interesting about either the hardware or the software. But yeah, I just, not off the top of my head, Brandon. I think that's kind of it.
Okay.
If I think of anything else, I'll let you know. But
please do.
Yeah, and it was how we had to figure out how to build that stuff. Game developers now, it's largely formulaic, and that's no disrespect to some of the genius that goes into it. We had no real precedent as to how we would put the stuff together, other than let's get started, and because it was really at the genesis stage of what we now call the games industry, really. And you learn a lot about taking risks. You learn a lot about just trying stuff out creatively, and I still have to this day, probably a healthy or unhealthy attitude to taking risks in development, because we just had to try things out and break it and try it again until it worked. And that's an ideology I think that's no bad thing to have in the creative sector.